The millionaire found triplets crying at the grocery store, and one of them was wearing his missing daughter's necklace. Rain fell mercilessly as Richard Parker pulled up in front of a small corner grocery store. It wasn't where he usually shopped, but the downpour had forced him to seek shelter in the first place he could find. The clock on the dashboard read 7:42 p. Far too late for someone who had only intended to buy bread and milk on his way home from work. Richard turned off the engine and watched the raindrops slide down the windshield. There was something hypnotic about their rhythm, something that allowed him, for a few brief moments, to forget that he would be returning to an empty house. Forget that the calendar in his kitchen marked exactly 1 year and 2 days since Alina disappeared. 1 year. 367 days without answers. With a sigh, he grabbed his umbrella and stepped out. The grocery store had that typical fluorescent lighting, slightly yellowed with age. A bell above the door announced his entrance, but the man behind the counter barely lifted his eyes from the newspaper. "Good evening," Richard greeted out of habit. The cashier responded with a distracted nod. It was the kind of place where people came and went without really being noticed, and that suited Richard perfectly. In recent months, he had developed a discomfort with lingering gazes and polite questions about how he was feeling. He walked down the narrow aisles, picking up only the essentials: bread, milk, some fruit, food for one person. It was when he reached the canned goods section that he heard it. A soft, muffled sob, as if whoever was crying was desperately trying not to be heard. Richard stopped, a can of beans suspended in mid-air. The sob came from the next aisle over, where the cleaning products were. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He'd often seen children having tantrums in stores, but there was something about that sound. It wasn't the demanding cry of a child denied something. It was different. It sounded desperate. He placed the can in his basket and walked around to the adjacent aisle. There they were, 3 little girls, huddled between the cleaning supplies and the wall. At first glance, they looked almost identical. Same delicate features, same facial structure, definitely triplets. They wore worn-out clothes that were much too big. One of them, with longer hair, stood protectively in front of the others. The second hid her face against the first one's shoulder, her tiny shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And the third, apparently the most fragile, had huge eyes, red from crying so much. All 3 froze when they saw Richard. The one standing in front quickly wiped her tears away with the dirty sleeve of her blouse. "We're leaving soon," she said, her voice trembling. Richard stood paralyzed. These weren't just 3 kids crying in a grocery store. They were 3 children who were clearly alone, dirty, with that look he recognized from documentaries about war zones, the look of those who've learned far too early that the world is not safe. "Are you by yourselves?" he asked, kneeling so he was at their eye level, but keeping enough distance not to scare them. The girl in front hesitated, clearly torn between the truth and whatever she had been instructed to say. "Our mum's outside," she finally replied, but her eyes darted to the entrance of the store, where rain continued to pour with no sign of an adult waiting. "I see," Richard responded gently. "You look cold. And hungry." The second girl sniffled, looking at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "How many days has it been since you've had a proper meal?" Richard asked. Another silence. The girl who was speaking seemed to weigh the risks. "2, she finally said, "but we're okay. We're just waiting for the rain to stop." That was when the third girl, until then silent, looked at him with wide, sad eyes. And in that moment, Richard saw it. Hanging around the girl's thin neck, partially hidden by the torn collar of her blouse, was a necklace. A simple cord with a single charm, a silver star. The world seemed to stop. The distant beeping at the checkout, the sound of the rain outside, even his own breathing, all of it vanished as his gaze locked onto that small metal object. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The silver star, with that tiny notch on the top point, was identical to the one on the necklace he'd had specially made for Alina's 5th birthday. The necklace she was wearing the day she disappeared from the playground, while her babysitter had been distracted for just 2 minutes. "Nice necklace," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The small girl instinctively brought her hand to the charm, as if to protect it. "It's Hazel's," the girl in front said quickly. She found it. Where did she find it? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice casual while his heart pounded against his ribs. On the street, the girl replied, but there was hesitation in her voice. We didn't steal it. Of course not, Richard assured her. He looked again at the three of them, at their thin faces, at the clothes not suited for the cold, at the obvious fear in their posture. He made a decision. Would you like something to eat? I can buy some sandwiches. The change was immediate. All three pairs of eyes lit up, though they tried to hide their hope. We don't want to be a bother, said the one who spoke, but her eyes betrayed her words. It's no bother at all, Richard assured them. You can wait here while I pick out a few things. They nodded, still wary, but the prospect of food was too strong to refuse. Richard stepped away but kept them in sight as he grabbed pre-made sandwiches, juice boxes, cereal bars, and chocolate. The silver star necklace pulsed in his mind like a beacon. Coincidence? Maybe. There were thousands of star necklaces in the world. But that notch, that tiny detail. When he returned, they were still there, though they looked ready to run at the first sign of danger. He handed them the sandwiches, which they accepted with wide eyes. You can eat right here, he said, giving them space. I'll pay for my groceries and come back. At the checkout, while the cashier rang up his items with disinterest, Richard couldn't stop thinking. 1 year of searching, 1 year of investigations that led nowhere. 1 year of being told by the police that the chances got slimmer every day. And now this, a little girl, wearing the same unique necklace as his daughter. Are those your kids? The cashier asked suddenly, glancing over Richard's shoulder at the three girls devouring the sandwiches. No, Richard answered automatically. Then, after a pause, he added, At least not yet. The man shrugged, clearly not really interested in the answer. Richard paid and went back to where the girls were, noticing how they ate with a mix of speed and caution, as though afraid someone might snatch the food away at any moment. What are your names? He asked, sitting on a nearby stool, keeping a respectful distance. The girl who spoke hesitated, but the question seemed harmless enough. I'm Myla, she finally answered. That's Lena, she pointed to the second girl, and that's Hazel, she finished, indicating the third, the one with the necklace. You're triplets, aren't you? Richard asked gently. Myla nodded, a flicker of pride briefly lighting her face. We were born together, she said. I was born first, then Lena, then Hazel. Nice to meet you all. My name's Richard. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? Myla visibly tensed. We'll manage, she answered defensively. In this rain? Richard asked gently. And the cold is getting worse. The three exchanged looks. There was a silent communication between them, the kind that only exists among those who share more than just genes. Why do you want to know? Myla finally asked. Richard thought carefully before responding. He couldn't simply say he suspected Hazel's necklace was connected to his missing daughter. That would sound crazy, even to him. Because it's raining, it's getting late, and you're children who need help, he said simply. I have a house with empty bedrooms. You can take a hot shower, eat a decent meal, and sleep in a real bed. Myla frowned, clearly weighing the risks. How do we know we can trust you? She asked, far too mature for her young age. Good question, Richard acknowledged. You don't, just like I don't know if I can trust that you won't steal my things while I'm asleep. The honesty of his reply seemed to surprise Myla. She almost smiled. We don't steal, she said firmly. Never. Then we have a start, Richard replied. Look, I won't lie. You remind me of my daughter. She isn't with me anymore, and I would feel like a monster leaving the three of you out in this weather. Something about the mention of his daughter seemed to change Myla's calculation. She looked at her sisters, who had finished their sandwiches and now watched hopefully at the still unopened juice boxes. Okay, she finally agreed in a low, cautious voice. We can go with you. Leaving the grocery store proved a small logistical challenge. The rain was still coming down hard, and Richard only had one umbrella. He ended up carrying Hazel, the smallest, while Myla and Lena ran beside him under the umbrella's precarious shelter. When they reached the car, another issue arose. There were no child safety seats. Richard hesitated, aware of traffic laws, but the alternative was to leave them in the rain. "It's close," he explained, helping them into the back seat. "I'll drive slowly." The ride home was silent. In the rearview mirror, Richard watched the three of them squeeze together in the back seat, looking out the window. Hazel absent-mindedly fiddled with the necklace, spinning the silver star between her tiny fingers. Richard's house was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was comfortable. A home planned for a family that, until a year ago, was just a father and a daughter. Now, the empty rooms seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, to fill them again. When he opened the door and turned on the lights, Richard saw his home through the girl's eyes, the soft couch with neat cushions, the spotless kitchen visible through the breakfast bar, the framed pictures on the walls, the feeling of a home. "Come on in," he said, holding the door. They stepped inside hesitantly, like wild animals ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. Their wet clothes left small puddles on the wooden floor, but Richard barely noticed. "I'll get towels so you can dry off," he said, heading to the hall closet. When he returned, they were exactly where he'd left them, as if afraid to move without permission. He handed them thick towels, noticing their surprise at the fabric's softness. "It's so soft," Lena whispered, speaking for the first time. Her voice was gentle, almost musical. "You must still be hungry," Richard said. "How about a warm shower first and then something to eat?" The girls exchanged looks again, that silent communication that seemed so natural among them. "Can we shower together?" Myla asked. "We always stay together." Richard understood the implicit fear. "Of course," he agreed. "I'll show you where the bathroom is and leave clean towels for you. You can lock the door." The relief on their faces was evident. Richard led them to the bathroom, explained how to work the shower, left soap, shampoo, and fresh towels, then gave them privacy, closing the door. While he prepared a simple meal, pasta with tomato sauce and grated cheese, Richard tried to organize his thoughts. Hazel's necklace, the silver star. Could it really be the same one? And if it was, how had it ended up with her? The sound of childish laughter coming from the bathroom interrupted his thoughts, a sound almost forgotten in his house. For a moment, Richard closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine that it was Alina in there, bathing after a day of playing. Then reality returned. It wasn't Alina, but here were three children who, by chance or fate, had crossed his path precisely on the anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. When the girls reappeared in the kitchen, they were transformed. Clean, with still damp hair, wearing Richard's old t-shirts as improvised nightgowns, they looked younger and more vulnerable. Now that the grime was gone, their similarity was even more noticeable. Hazel's star necklace gleamed against her clean skin, almost calling attention to itself. "Take a seat," Richard invited, indicating the table he'd already set. With wide eyes, they climbed into the chairs. They watched Richard's every move as though it were an unfamiliar ritual, copying him when he placed the napkin in his lap and holding the utensils with extreme care. "Feel free to eat," he encouraged. "There's plenty." After an initial hesitation, they began to eat. Slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, as though each forkful confirmed that yes, this was real. "Is it good?" Richard asked, watching them. Three heads nodded in unison, cheeks full of food. After the meal, exhaustion was evident in their drooping eyes and stifled yawns. Richard led them to the guest room, where he made up the double bed with fresh sheets and a soft comforter. "You can sleep here," he said. "My room is just down the hall. If you need anything during the night, just call me." They looked at the bed as if it were a mirage. "It's all for us?" Lena asked in disbelief. "All yours," Richard confirmed. "Good night." He left the door slightly ajar and the hallway light on, in case they woke up disoriented during the night. Before going to his own room, he stopped in the hallway and glanced back. They were already on the bed, huddled in the middle as though the space was too big for them to occupy properly, clinging to each other like little animals seeking warmth and security. Together against the world. And on tiny Hazel, the star necklace reflected the dim light from the corridor, like a beacon in the darkness. Richard closed his bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. 3 abandoned children, a necklace that seemed impossible, an anniversary of loss that now somehow also marked a beginning. He didn't know what morning would bring, whether the necklace was truly Alina's or just a cruel coincidence. But for the first time in a year, he felt something new stir within his chest. It felt like hope. Richard couldn't sleep. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he stared at the wall separating his room from the guest room where the 3 girls now slept. The silence of the house, once so familiar, now seemed charged with something different. Expectation, uncertainty, possibility. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. when he finally made a decision. He got up silently and walked down the hallway to the girls' room. The door was still ajar, just as he had left it. Taking care not to make a sound, he peeked inside. The 3 of them were still sound asleep in the same position, huddled together in the middle of the large bed, Hazel protected between her sisters. Richard watched for a moment the peaceful rise and fall of their breathing, their faces relaxed in sleep, in a way they did not show when awake. Then his eyes fell on what he had come for. The silver star necklace lay on the nightstand next to the bed. Hazel must have taken it off before sleeping, a habit Alina also had. "So you don't strangle yourself at night," she used to say with that childlike logic that always made him smile. With extreme caution, Richard reached out and picked up the necklace. He left the room as quietly as he had entered, letting the girls remain in their deep slumber. Back in his own room, he turned on the small desk lamp and sat down, finally able to examine the object that had haunted his thoughts since the moment he first saw it. The cord was simple, made of fine silver, yet sturdy enough for a child's use. Richard turned the small star pendant in his fingers, looking for the detail that would make the identification absolute. There it was, on the upper part of the star, almost unnoticeable unless you knew exactly where to look, a tiny crescent-shaped notch. It wasn't a flaw, but a deliberate addition Richard had requested from the jeweler. "Something unique," he had said. "Something that makes this necklace impossible to reproduce." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the confirmation. There was no longer any doubt. This was Alina's necklace, the same one he'd had made for her birthday, the same one she'd worn on the day she vanished. During the first month after Alina's disappearance, the police had conducted an intensive search. They interviewed the babysitter dozens of times. They combed the playground and the surrounding area. Flyers with Alina's smiling face had been posted all over the city. Richard had even hired private investigators when the police began to scale back their efforts. But after a while, the official searches disappeared. "These cases," Detective Stevens had said, avoiding his gaze, "the more time passes, the lower the odds." And now, almost a year later, this little piece of metal suggested something Richard barely dared to consider. Alina might be alive. His heart pounded with a mixture of hope and fear. If the necklace survived, maybe she had too. But then how did it get off her? How had it ended up with Hazel? 1,000 scenarios began to form in his mind, some hopeful, some too horrifying to contemplate for long. For hours, he stayed there, the metallic star in his hand, as though the mere physical contact with the object might somehow connect him to his missing daughter. When the sky started to lighten, Richard finally slipped the necklace into the pocket of his pajama pants. He needed to learn more. He needed to find out how that necklace ended up with Hazel, without scaring the girls or making them feel they had done something wrong. Just when we see the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen as Richard flipped another one in the pan. He'd decided to make a special breakfast, partly because he imagined the girls rarely had homemade meals, partly because he needed to keep his hands busy while his mind worked on how to bring up the necklace. He heard light footsteps in the hallway and turned to find 3 sleepy-eyed faces watching him from the kitchen doorway. The girls were still wearing the oversized t-shirts that served as nightgowns, their hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning," Richard said, trying to sound casual. "Did you sleep well?" Myla, clearly the group's spokesperson, nodded. "Yes, sir." "You can just call me Richard. Was the bed comfortable?" "Very," Lena replied, her voice still thick with sleep. "I've never slept in a bed so soft." The simple statement made Richard's heart ache. "I hope you're hungry. I made pancakes." The three pairs of eyes lit up noticeably. Richard motioned to the table, already set with plates, forks, glasses of orange juice, and a stack of golden pancakes. While the girls ate with restrained enthusiasm, Richard discreetly watched Hazel. She seemed the shyest of the three, speaking little. Her big eyes always alert, observing everything. The kind of child who notices details others miss. "Hazel," he finally said, aiming for a casual tone, "you're not wearing your necklace today." The small girl raised her hand to her neck instinctively, as if only then realizing the necklace was gone. "It must be in the bedroom," she answered in a near whisper. "I take it off to sleep." Richard nodded, feigning a calm he didn't feel. "It's a really pretty necklace. Where did you say you found it again?" The three exchanged glances. It was Mila who responded, always protective. "Hazel found it on the street," she said, though there was subtle hesitation in her voice. "Got it," Richard replied, serving another pancake to Lena, who had polished off her plate with surprising speed. "Have you been living on the streets for a long time?" Another glance between the sisters. "A few weeks," Mila finally said. "We stayed in different places." Richard nodded, giving them time, not wanting to push too hard and risk losing the fragile trust they were starting to build. "I guess you were lucky to find that necklace," he commented after a moment. "Seems like a special piece." Hazel, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "It was shining in the grass," she said in a soft voice. "Near that house." Mila shot her sister a warning look, but Hazel continued, apparently sensing something in Richard's tone that encouraged her to speak. "There was a girl crying inside the house," she added. "We heard her at night." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. With conscious effort, he kept his expression neutral, even though his heart now pounded hard against his ribs. "A girl crying," he repeated, trying not to show the urgency he felt. "Which house was this?" Mila, realizing Hazel had already said too much, sighed and took control of the conversation. "A big house on Oak Street," she said reluctantly. "Near that small neighborhood park, not the main city park. Sometimes we slept in that small park, under the slide." Richard knew the place. A small neighborhood park, about 10 blocks away from the central playground where Alina had disappeared. "Did you see the girl who was crying?" he asked, still keeping his tone casual, though every fiber of his being screamed for more information. Mila shook her head. "No, we only heard her." "It was sad," Lena added, surprising Richard. The middle girl rarely spoke. She cried like desperate. Suddenly, the air felt too heavy for Richard to breathe. A lump formed in his throat. "There was a man and a woman who always went in and out of the house," Mila continued, now that the subject had been opened. "They looked scary." "Scary how?" Richard asked. Mila shrugged, clearly fighting to find the right words to describe her impression. "They never smiled," she finally said. "They were always looking around, like they were afraid someone would see them. The woman had bright red hair, like fire. The man was big, with a dark beard." "We never got close," Hazel added. "They seemed bad." "Do you know if they lived there?" Richard asked, mentally storing every detail. "I don't think so," Mila replied. "They came at different times. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes at night. They never stayed long. It was 2 days after we last saw them that Hazel found the necklace," Lena said. "It was right by the fence of the house." Richard nodded, trying not to show the storm raging inside him. Everything the girls described could be a coincidence. Maybe the necklace had been stolen from Alina. Maybe the crying child was someone else entirely. But what if it wasn't? "Do you remember exactly where this house is?" he finally asked. Mila nodded. "It's a light blue house with a white gate. Number 47. The precision surprised Richard. Mila noticed and shrugged. "We always pay attention to places," she explained, "so we know where it's safe and where it isn't." "I understand," Richard said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Thank you for telling me." "Are we in trouble?" Hazel suddenly asked, her eyes wide with worry. "Because of the necklace?" Richard shook his head immediately. "No, of course not. You didn't do anything wrong. Actually, I think you might have found something very important. The three looked at him curiously, but Richard wasn't ready to explain more. Not while his own mind was still trying to process the possibilities. What if we watch a movie after breakfast, he suggested, deliberately changing the subject. I have plenty of kids' movies that I kept. The idea of watching a movie seemed to fascinate the girls, particularly Lena, whose eyes lit up instantly. Richard allowed the conversation to shift to lighter topics, discussing which films they might enjoy, while his mind worked tirelessly. Oak Street, number 47. A man with a dark beard, a woman with red hair, a crying child, and Alina's necklace. He needed to check that house, but he couldn't just abandon the three girls. Not now. He also couldn't risk alerting whoever might be involved in Alina's disappearance if there really was a connection. He had to be careful, methodical. He needed help. As the girls finished breakfast, Richard discreetly touched the pocket where he had placed the necklace. That small metal object, that star with its special notch, now represented something powerful: hope. The days that followed brought a strange new normalcy to Richard's house. The three girls, who at first tiptoed around as though walking on eggshells, began slowly to relax. The changes came in small ways, the volume of their voices gradually rising, their steps growing less hesitant, their expressions less fearful. Richard watched this transformation with a mixture of fascination and sorrow. Fascination at the resilience of children, at how they adapted to new circumstances. Sorrow at what that adaptation implied, how accustomed they were to changing, surviving, accepting whatever life threw at them, good or bad. The first week was a period of adjustment for everyone. Richard, used to solitude and silence, now found himself attuned to every sound, every movement in the house. He quickly learned the girls' preferences, how Mila preferred toast with butter for breakfast, while Lena liked cereal, and Hazel barely ate until her sisters were finished, as if she wanted to make sure they were fed first. While discreetly investigating the house on Oak Street, Richard began establishing a routine with the girls. Breakfast together every morning, followed by some activity. A movie, a board game he unearthed from a box in the attic, a walk in the backyard when the weather allowed. In the afternoon, while the girls rested or watched TV, he made phone calls, researched online, and tried to find out more about the couple they had described. On the third day, Richard noticed something curious. The girls followed him around the house, not constantly or blatantly, but like little shadows that appeared in the corners of his vision. If he went to the kitchen to make lunch, soon a head would peek through the doorway. If he sat in the living room to read, it wouldn't be long before one of them appeared with some seemingly casual question. Even when he worked in his office, he heard light footsteps in the hallway, casually, passing by the half-open door. At first, he thought they were just curious or perhaps bored. But then he realized they were monitoring him. Like wild animals, never losing sight of the source of food and safety, always alert for any sign of danger or abandonment. It was Lena who first approached without any pretext. On the fourth night, while Richard was sitting on the sofa reading, she simply walked into the living room and sat on the other end, holding a picture book he had found in a box of Alina's belongings. She said nothing, asked for nothing. She just sat there, turning the pages slowly, occasionally glancing at Richard as if to confirm her presence was acceptable. The next morning, passing through the living room, Richard found Hazel sitting alone on the rug, drawing with the colored pencils he had bought the day before. The other two were in the backyard, watching a bird's nest they had discovered. Richard paused, silently observing the younger girl's intense concentration as she worked on her drawing. "What are you drawing?" he finally asked. Hazel looked up, not startled but cautious, as always. After a moment, she turned the paper so he could see it. It was a simple drawing, with that direct, honest quality only children can capture. 4 stick figures held hands in a circle, one large one with what looked like a scribbled beard, clearly Richard, and 3 smaller ones of slightly different sizes. In the center of the circle, a star shone, drawn with special care, its points well defined and colored a bright yellow. Richard felt his throat tighten. "That's really beautiful," he managed to say. "That's us," Hazel explained in her soft voice. You and me, Mila and Lena. And the star in the middle, Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Hazel touched the drawing gently with the tip of her finger. It's for good luck, she said simply. Like my necklace. Richard nodded, not trusting his voice at that moment. Hazel studied him with her big, wise eyes, as though she understood exactly what he was feeling. Can I hang it up? He finally asked. A tiny smile lit Hazel's face, a rare, precious smile. Richard realized that of the three, Hazel smiled the least. She nodded and handed him the drawing carefully. Later that day, with the drawing taped to the refrigerator door, Richard watched the three girls in the kitchen as they all worked together making cookies. The activity had been Lena's idea. Surprisingly, "We've never baked cookies," she had said, with a shyness that quickly turned into excitement when Richard suggested they do it that afternoon. Mila, always practical, measured the ingredients with a seriousness that was almost scientific. Lena mixed the dough with enthusiasm, occasionally licking her fingers when she thought no one was looking. Hazel, meticulous, arranged the chocolate chips in perfect rows before adding them to the dough. It was when he saw Mila grab a spoon from the drawer without having to ask where it was, when he noticed how Lena automatically lowered her voice when he answered a phone call, when he watched Hazel humming softly as she worked. That was when Richard realized they weren't just passing through his house, they were starting to inhabit it. And something inside him, a void he'd carried for a year, began to fill with a sensation he had almost forgotten. Affection. Not just the urge to protect them until he found Alina, not just pity for their situation, but a genuine and growing affection for who they were. Three small, distinct people, each with her own personality, fears and tiny triumphs. The following week, Richard took the girls shopping for clothes. He'd noticed that the few items they had in their small backpacks were worn beyond repair, and his t-shirts turned pajamas, though charmingly oversized, weren't a long-term solution. The mall was an adventure. The three were awed by the escalators, by the fountain in the center, by the simple abundance of everything. Richard noticed how they clung to each other's hands tightly when passing through crowds, how Mila always positioned herself between her sisters and strangers, how Hazel's eyes grew wide at the brightly lit store windows. You can pick whatever you want," he said as they entered a children's clothing store. The girls looked at him warily, as though expecting a catch. "Really?" Mila asked, her voice cautious. "Really," Richard confirmed. "You need new clothes. Anything you like." Even with permission, their choices were modest. Mila selected jeans and simple t-shirts, always practical, in shades of blue and green. Lena gravitated toward brighter colors, a purple t-shirt with sequins, a yellow skirt that twirled when she moved, but still stuck to basic items and only a few. Hazel hesitated in front of a blue dress with tiny silver stars embroidered along the skirt, gently touching the fabric before looking at Richard, an unspoken question in her eyes. "You like that one?" he asked. She nodded but made no move to pick it up. "Then it's yours," Richard said, taking the dress off the hanger and putting it into the cart. After a moment of hesitation, he grabbed two more of the same style in different sizes, and for your sisters too, if they want. The sales clerk, an older woman with a kind smile, watched the interaction. "Your daughters are lovely," she commented as she rang up the purchases, "and they look so different, despite being triplets." Richard hesitated only for a second. "Thank you," he simply replied, without correcting her assumption. As they left the store, he noticed the girls walking closer to him than before, almost as if they belonged together, and for the first time, he didn't mentally correct that thought. That night brought a thunderstorm. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning lit up the bedroom every few minutes. Richard was reading in the living room when he heard light footsteps in the hallway. He looked up to find the three girls standing in the doorway, wearing their new pajamas, matching nightgowns in different shades of blue, their eyes wide at each crash of thunder. "It's really loud," Lena said, her voice trembling. "Can we stay here?" Mila asked, trying to sound casual but clearly frightened. Richard set his book aside. "Of course. Come on, we can watch a movie until the storm passes." The three settled on the sofa beside him, initially leaving some space between them, but inching closer with each roar of thunder until they were all pressed against him. Hazel, in particular, shuddered at every crash, hiding her face against Richard's arm. He adjusted the blanket over them and turned up the TV volume to mask the storm's noise. Gradually, he felt their small bodies relax against him. "We used to be scared of storms when we lived on the streets," Mila said suddenly, her voice low. Richard looked at her, surprised by the unexpected confession. "Were you on the streets for a long time?" he asked gently. Mila shrugged, a gesture that seemed too heavy for her small shoulders. "A while. It's hard to know how long." "And before that?" Richard pressed carefully. "We lived with our mom," Lena answered, joining in a small place. "It was only one room," Mila added. "But it had a red rug our mom said was magical." "How was it magical?" Richard asked, hoping to keep the conversation flowing now that they were finally opening up. "When we sat on it," Hazel explained, surprisingly entering the conversation, "Mom said we could go anywhere. She told us stories about the places we visited on the magic rug," Lena said, her eyes shining at the memory. "Beaches, forests, snowy mountains. She told us stories every night," Hazel added, "even when she was really tired. She worked a lot," Mila continued, "always 2 jobs and sometimes 3. We hardly saw her," Lena said, sadness evident in her voice. "She left before we woke up and came back after we were already asleep. But on weekends," Hazel said with a small smile, "she was with us all day. Then we all got sick at the same time," Hazel continued, the smile fading. "Mom had to miss work to take care of us. And they fired her," Mila concluded. "All her jobs." Richard listened in silence, each word painting a painfully clear picture. "We lost our room," Lena said. "We stayed in a shelter for a while, but it was bad. People fought a lot. They tried to separate us," Mila added, anger trembling in her voice. "Said it was easier to find space for just one kid." "Mom didn't let that happen," Hazel said. "She said we would never be separated." Another crash of thunder shook the house, but the girls barely noticed, immersed in the story they were telling. "We started sleeping in different places," Mila continued. "Under bridges, in abandoned buildings, in parks. Mom said it was only for a while until she found another job. She always brought us something to eat," Lena said, her voice trembling, "even when we saw that she hadn't eaten anything. Sometimes," Hazel added, "she pretended she wasn't hungry, but her stomach would make noises." Richard swallowed hard, imagining the desperate struggle of a single mother trying to keep her 3 daughters together and fed. "One day," Mila said, her voice now barely above a whisper, "she said she'd found a job. She'd be a cook in a restaurant. She looked happy. She fixed our hair," Hazel remembered. "She braided all of us and sang that song we liked," Lena added. "She said she'd buy us a present to celebrate," Lena went on. Mila took a deep breath. "She left and never came back." The silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. Richard felt the words sink into his chest like stones. "We waited," Mila continued after a moment. "For 3 days in the same place. She told us not to leave. We stayed under that bridge near the river," Lena said, "our little spot. Then the food ran out," Mila went on, "and it started raining really hard. The river water was rising," Hazel said, her eyes wide with the memory. "We got scared. We had to find another place," Mila finished. "But we always went back to see if Mom had returned." "How long ago was this?" Richard asked, his voice rough. "Many weeks," Mila said. "We don't really know how to count time." Richard closed his eyes briefly, trying to keep his emotions in check. When he opened them, he found 3 pairs of eyes watching him intently. "Is Mom coming back?" Hazel asked suddenly, the directness and childlike hope in her voice causing something inside Richard to break. "I don't know, sweetheart," he answered honestly. "But something must have happened. I'm sure she'd never leave you by choice." Hazel nodded, accepting the answer. Her small hand found Richard's and gripped it with surprising strength. "Are you going away too?" Lena asked, her voice so low he almost didn't hear her. It was that question, the raw vulnerability, that finally broke his composure. Richard felt tears sliding down his face, unable to hold them back. The girls looked at him, surprised and a little alarmed. "Grown-ups aren't supposed to cry," Hazel said seriously, as though reciting a learned rule. "Everyone cries sometimes," Richard corrected gently. "Even grown-ups, especially when they feel a lot of sorrow." "Are you sad?" Myla asked, watching him closely. "A little," he admitted. "About everything you've been through. And I'm feeling a lot of things all at once." "No," he finally answered Lena's question. "I'm not going anywhere." He realized it was true the moment he said it. Even if he found Alina tomorrow, he couldn't just send these 3 children back to the streets. Somehow, in just a few days, they had become too important. He opened his arms, and the 3 pressed themselves against him. He felt their small bodies tense for a moment before relaxing into his embrace. "With me, you'll never be alone again," he promised in a low, firm voice, "or never again." And in that moment, as he hugged 3 children the world had thrown his way, Richard felt a certainty grow within him. If these girls, lost and alone, had survived for weeks on the streets, finding their way to his door, to Alina's necklace, then perhaps his daughter was still out there somewhere, too. Waiting. Surviving. Waiting to be found. The storm continued outside, but inside the living room, surrounded by the warmth of 3 trusting little bodies, Richard allowed himself to believe. In family. In reunion. In possibilities that just days ago had seemed gone forever. A home none of them had ever dared to dream of, beginning to take shape around them. Richard watched the triplets playing in the yard through his office window. Wearing new clothes, running and laughing in the afternoon sun, they looked like completely different children from those he had found in the grocery store 2 weeks earlier. Hazel wore the blue dress with silver stars, the necklace shining against her skin. It was that detail that brought Richard back to the reality of his mission. Alina's necklace, the house on Oak Street, the crying child. He had gathered enough information to justify the next step. He needed professional help. He couldn't just show up at that house, not with 3 children depending on him now. Not when any wrong move could tip off possible kidnappers. If his daughter was still alive, he couldn't risk driving her even further away. Richard picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Parker Investigations," answered a deep voice on the other end. "Sean, it's Richard Cole." There was a moment of silence before the man replied, his voice now tinged with surprise. "Richard, it's been a while. I need you, it's about Alina." Another silence, longer this time. "I thought the case was closed," Sean finally said, cautious. "Never for me," Richard answered, "and now I've got something new, something solid." Half an hour later, Richard opened the door for Sean Parker, the private detective he had hired in the first months after Alina vanished. A tall, lean man with short, graying hair and observant eyes that seemed to take in every detail around him. He wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, unassuming but professional. They had worked intensively for 3 months until the leads ran dry, and Richard reluctantly stopped paying for daily investigations. Occasionally, Sean still called whenever he heard something that might be related, but even those calls became rare over time. "Come in," Richard said, leading him to the office. "I want you to meet someone afterward, but first, we need to talk." In the office, Richard closed the door and motioned for Sean to sit. Then, without preamble, he took the silver star necklace out of a locked desk drawer and placed it on the table. "Recognize this?" Sean leaned forward, examining it without touching. "Alina's necklace," he answered, voice controlled but eyes sharper. "Where'd you find it?" Richard told him everything. The encounter with the girls at the grocery store, the necklace around Hazel's neck, the story about the house on Oak Street, the sound of a crying child, the suspicious couple. Sean listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. "I want you to check out that house," Richard concluded. "And the couple, if you can identify them. We need to find out if Alina was there, if she's still there, or where they might have taken her." Sean nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need the necklace. For forensic analysis." Richard hesitated. He'd grown used to having that small object near him, the only tangible link to his missing daughter, but he knew it was necessary. "All right," he finally agreed. "Do what you need to do." "And the girls who found the necklace," Sean continued. "I need to talk to them too." "They're here," Richard said. "They're living with me." Sean raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You adopted them?" "Not officially, not yet, but yes, I'm taking care of them." Sean nodded, making no further comment. "I'll start immediately," he said, placing the necklace in a special envelope. "First the house, then we'll look for info on the couple." 2 days later, Sean returned with his initial findings. Richard received him in the office again, anxious for any news. "The house is empty," Sean began without preamble, "but there are clear signs of recent occupation. I'd say it was abandoned no more than 2 weeks ago." "Right after the girls found the necklace," Richard observed. "Exactly. I found some interesting things." Sean opened a folder and spread some photos on the table. First, marks in the basement. Looks like there was furniture bolted to the floor, possibly a bed or crib. "And I found this." He placed a small transparent plastic bag on the table. Inside was a tiny pink hair tie with a plastic butterfly. "It could belong to any child," Richard said, trying to steady his voice. "Yes, but the description matches one of the hair ties Alina was wearing when she disappeared, according to the police report." Richard felt his heart race. "What else?" "Neighbors confirmed a couple showed up occasionally. They didn't live there full time. They'd appear for a few days, then vanish for weeks. No one knew their names. They kept to themselves, didn't socialize." "Do the descriptions match what the girls said? Red-haired woman, bearded man?" Sean nodded. "Yes. And I got something even more interesting." He placed another photo on the table, a grainy image from a security camera. "This is from a gas station 2 blocks from the house. Caught the couple filling up about a month ago." Richard studied the picture. The quality wasn't great, but he could make out a woman with bright red hair and a burly man with a dark beard, exactly as the girls had described. "Do you recognize either of them?" Sean asked. Richard looked closely, then shook his head. "No, I've never seen them before." "I didn't expect you to. I ran their faces through police databases. Got a partial match on the man." Sean placed another photo on the table, a mugshot of a similar man, though with different hair and facial hair. "Gregory Pearson, arrested for document fraud 8 years ago in another state. Served 18 months and disappeared after parole. So he has a record. Yes, but what really caught my attention were other complaints." Sean opened another file. "Over the past 5 years, at least 3 different towns have reported complaints against a couple with a similar description, always related to questionable adoptions." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. "Adoptions?" "Illegal adoptions," Sean clarified. "They're not licensed agents or connected to any legitimate adoption agencies. The scheme seems to be, they identify vulnerable children, often in parks, schools, or simply on the street. In some cases, apparently, they even abduct kids directly." The word abduct made Richard's stomach turn. "Then," Sean continued, "they look for desperate families who want to adopt but can't or won't go through the legal system, people with criminal records, foreigners without permanent visas, couples who'd be rejected because of age or other factors. And they sell the children to those families," Richard finished, his voice low. "Essentially, yes. They use fake identities, operate in different cities for short periods, usually renting isolated or abandoned houses as temporary bases. When the pressure gets too high or they finish a delivery, they move to another city." "How did you find out all this? If the police know, why haven't they been arrested?" Sean leaned back in his chair. "The problem is there's never enough proof. The families who receive the children rarely cooperate. They're afraid of losing the child or facing criminal charges. Also, the couple is careful. They leave no paper trail, never use the same name twice, always pay in cash." Richard thought for a moment. "And you think Alina was one of their victims?" "The profile fits perfectly," Sean replied. "Alina was the ideal age, young enough to adapt to a new family, old enough not to need infant care. Healthy, pretty, well-behaved, and the way she disappeared, quickly, with no witnesses, in a public park, matches their method." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. The idea that his daughter had been abducted to be sold to another family was almost unbearable. And yet, there was a spark of hope in the pain. If that was the case, Alina was likely still alive. "Did you find any leads on where they might have gone this time?" he asked at last. Sean nodded. "I managed to track the car in the security footage, a black sedan with a partially visible plate. It was spotted passing through a toll booth on the interstate highway going north 2 weeks ago. Here's the interesting part." He paused, placing another photo on the table. The toll system captured this. The image showed the same car, now with the plate clearly visible. In the back seat, partially obscured but recognizable, there was a child. "You can't see the face clearly," Sean cautioned as Richard leaned closer, heart pounding. "We can't confirm it's Alina, but it's a little girl, apparently the right age, with the right hair color." Richard studied the image intently, as though he could extract more details by sheer force of will. The child in the photo had light brown hair like Alina. Her face was angled downward, partially hidden, but something in the posture, in the tilt of her head. "Where does that highway lead?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Northbrook, a small town about 3 hours from here. I called a few contacts in the local police. No one's reported seeing the couple, but they're on alert. We need to go there." Sean made a gesture of caution. "I'm working on it, Richard. I've got an informant checking every hotel and rental property in the area, but we have to be careful. If they realize we're onto them, they might vanish with Alina again," Richard said, understanding the risk. "Exactly. Or worse, they might get rid of the problem." A heavy silence fell over the office. The implication was clear and too terrible to say out loud. "How long until we have enough information to act?" Richard finally asked. "Give me 2 more days," Sean replied. "I'm following promising leads on a secluded property near Northbrook that was rented recently, paid in cash by a couple matching the description. I need to confirm before we make a move." Richard nodded, fighting the urge to jump in his car that very moment and drive to Northbrook. 2 days, he agreed, not more. When Sean stood to leave, Richard walked him to the door. In the hallway, they heard laughter coming from the living room. The triplets were watching a cartoon, totally absorbed in the bright story on the screen. "Richard," Sean said, his voice quieter now, "I won't ask how you plan to explain these girls to the authorities, or what you'll do with them when we find Alina." Richard met the detective's gaze. "I'm going to take care of all of them." Whatever Sean saw in Richard's face seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once, firmly. 2 days, he repeated. "Be ready." When the door closed behind Sean, Richard stood there for a moment, absorbing everything he had discovered. A couple involved in illegal adoptions, children kidnapped and sold, Alina possibly alive, possibly scared, possibly believing he had abandoned her, and now, finally, a solid lead, a trail to follow. Richard took a deep breath and returned to the living room, where 3 pairs of eyes briefly turned to him before going back to the cartoon. He sat on the sofa, letting Hazel snuggle against him the way she'd started doing lately. 2 days, he thought. In 2 days, he might be on his way to finding Alina, to bringing his daughter home, a home that now had room for 3 more little hearts. The 2 days Sean had promised stretched into 4. Richard swung between anxiety and despair, trying to maintain an air of normalcy for the triplets. In the mornings, he made breakfast, helped them draw, watched animated movies. In the evenings, once they were asleep, he stayed up poring over every detail Sean sent by text. On the afternoon of the 4th day, his phone rang. "I found them," Sean said bluntly. "They're staying at a guest house on the outskirts of Northbrook. Small place, off the radar, the kind that doesn't ask questions." Richard's heart pounded. "Are you sure it's them?" "Absolutely. Red-haired woman, bearded man. Registered as John and Mary Smith. Paid for 2 weeks, in cash." Richard glanced at the clock. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. How long to get there? 3 hours by car. "Richard, we have to be careful. I suggest we get the local police involved first and—" "No," Richard interrupted. "No police. Not yet. If they get arrested before they tell us where Alina is, we could lose her forever." There was a brief pause on the line. "I understand," Sean finally said. "Meet me at the gas station just outside town in an hour. Bring only what's essential." Richard hung up and stood still for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. The possibility of finally discovering Alina's whereabouts felt so close, so tangible, it almost hurt. In the living room, the triplets were watching a cartoon, completely engrossed. In the weeks they had been with him, they had transformed. Rounder faces, brighter eyes, more frequent smiles. Richard felt a surge of affection for them. "Girls," he said softly. 3 heads turned simultaneously. "I have to take a work trip," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Just for a day or 2. The reaction was immediate. Mila stiffened, her eyes instantly alert. Lena clutched a teddy bear to her chest. Hazel, the most sensitive of the 3, let her bottom lip tremble slightly. "You'll be staying with Mrs. Cooper," Richard continued, referring to the elderly neighbor he'd recently met, who had offered to help. "She's very kind and will take care of you until I come back." "You'll come back, right?" Hazel asked, her voice small. Richard's heart squeezed. He kneeled to be at their eye level. "Always," he promised, looking each of them in the eye. "I will always come back for you." An hour later, having dropped the girls off with Mrs. Cooper, a spry widow who immediately began talking about homemade cookies and board games, Richard met Sean at the agreed-upon station. "Ready?" the detective asked, studying Richard's tense face. Richard nodded, unable to trust his own voice. He carried only a small backpack with a change of clothes and a framed picture of Alina, his favorite, taken when she was 3, grinning widely while holding a strawberry ice cream cone, her face slightly smeared. The drive was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Richard watched the scenery blur past the window without really seeing it, trying to control the storm of emotions threatening to consume him. What if it wasn't Alina? What if it was, but she didn't recognize him? What if the couple denied everything? "What's the plan?" he finally asked when they saw the first signs for Northbrook. "Direct approach," Sean replied. "We'll introduce ourselves as private investigators looking for a missing child. We won't mention kidnapping or the police. The idea is to make them think we only want information, not to get them arrested." "What if they refuse to talk?" Sean cast a sideways glance at Richard. "I have ways of being persuasive, but let's hope we won't need them." The guest house was exactly what Richard expected. A 2-story building with peeling paint, a partially burned out neon sign, the kind of place where no one asks questions as long as you pay. Sean parked across the street. "Room 14, 2nd floor," he said. "Let's go." In the reception area, a middle-aged woman with a bored expression flipped through a magazine. "We're looking for Mr. and Mrs. Smith," Sean said, flashing a fake badge Richard had never seen him use before. "Room 14. The woman barely looked up. "They're upstairs," she replied disinterestedly. They climbed the narrow staircase in silence. The dimly lit hallway led them to a door with the faded number 14. "Let me speak first," Sean whispered. Richard nodded, his heart pounding against his ribs. Sean knocked 3 times. There was movement inside, a muffled voice, footsteps approaching. The door opened a few inches, revealing part of a woman's face framed by bright red hair. "Yes?" the woman asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "Mrs. Smith, we're private investigators," Sean said, his tone professional and neutral. "We'd like to ask some questions about a missing girl." The door began to close, but Sean was quicker, sliding his foot in the gap. "We're not here to cause trouble," he continued. "We just want information. The family is devastated." There was a moment of silence, then the door opened fully. The red-haired woman stared at them with hard eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "John, there are people here." From the cramped room, a burly man with a dark beard appeared, wearing jeans and a stained t-shirt. His eyes narrowed as he took in the visitors. "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping up beside the woman. "Like I told your wife, and we're private investigators," Sean repeated. "We're looking for a girl who's been missing for about a year. We believe you might have information." "We don't know anything about any girl," the man said quickly. "You've got the wrong people." Richard couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped forward, taking the framed photo out of his backpack. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She disappeared a year ago. Please, if you know anything at all." He held out the picture. The man and woman exchanged quick glances, but it was the almost imperceptible flicker of recognition in the man's eyes that confirmed for Richard they were on the right track. "Never seen her in my life," the woman said, but her voice trembled slightly. Sean stepped forward. "Listen," he said quietly. "We know what you do. Alternative adoptions. We're not here to judge you or turn you in. We just want to find the girl." "I have no idea what you're talking about," the woman insisted, but the man placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. "Come in," he finally said. "We can't talk in the hallway." The room was small and stuffy. A double bed in disarray, half-open suitcases, takeout containers strewn around. Richard remained standing, unable to sit, holding Alina's photo like a talisman. "What do you want to know?" the man asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Greg," the woman hissed in warning. "Shut up, Donna," he snapped. "We're done with this case anyway. It doesn't matter now." Richard felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. "So, you did see her? You took her?" The man, Greg, studied the photo for a long moment. "She looks familiar," he finally admitted, "but we deal with a lot of kids." "Alina Cole," Richard said, voice nearly pleading. "Light brown hair, green eyes. She wore a silver star necklace." Something flickered in the man's eyes. "The necklace," he murmured. "Yeah, I remember the necklace. The kid didn't want to take it off, even when—" He stopped abruptly, casting a glance at the woman. "Even when what?" Richard pressed, heart hammering. The man sighed heavily. "Look, we're not monsters, okay? We never hurt the kids. We just place them with families who really want them." "Where is my daughter?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "It was her," the man finally admitted, pointing to the photo. "We grabbed her at the park. It was easy. The babysitter was distracted on her phone. The girl came over when Donna offered her ice cream. Kids trust people like that." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the wave of nausea triggered by the casual description of how his daughter was taken. "Who did you give her to?" Sean asked, voice firm. "A couple for," Greg said. "We never know their real names. We never ask. They paid well. Wanted a well-mannered, healthy, pretty girl. Yours was perfect." Richard felt his legs weaken, leaning against the wall to keep from collapsing. "Where did they take her?" he managed to ask. "They said they were going to another town." "Riverview, I think." "Right, Donna?" The woman nodded reluctantly. "Riverview. About 5 hours north of here." "Do you have any names, addresses, anything?" Sean pressed. Greg shook his head. "We don't keep that info. It's safer that way." "But they'd be in Riverview," Richard insisted. "Probably," the man replied. "Said they had family there. The girl would have cousins to play with." Richard exchanged a look with Sean. It was a lead, not much, but enough to keep searching. "Was she okay?" Richard asked, voice barely a whisper. "When you handed her over, was she okay?" A shadow of something resembling remorse crossed Greg's face. "She cried a lot at first, called for you. But after a few days, kids adapt fast. By the time the couple took her, she'd calmed down." Richard nodded, unable to speak, the image of Alina crying for him burning in his mind like fire. "Let's go," Sean said, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "We have what we need." On the way out, Richard stopped and turned to the couple one more time. "If you get caught, confess. Tell the police everything you know about all the kids. Maybe it'll help your sentence." He didn't wait for an answer. He went down the stairs in a daze, guided only by Sean's steady hand on his shoulder. The journey to Riverview began at dawn the next day. After a sleepless night in a motel near the guest house, Richard was exhausted but too keyed up to feel the fatigue. "Riverview's population is small," Sean said as he drove. "About 15,000 people. That'll make the search easier." "Where do we start?" Richard asked, staring out the window at the passing scenery. "Adoption records. Even illegally, they'd need some paperwork to enroll the girl in school or get medical care. Probably forged, but still, there'd be some record." Riverview was a typical small American town, a main street with shops, restaurants, and basic services, surrounded by quiet residential areas. Mature trees lined the sidewalks. Children played in yards beneath the autumn sun. Their first stop was the county clerk's office. Sean introduced himself as a private investigator, working on an inheritance case, needing to track down family members. The story, combined with a few discreet $100 bills, secured the cooperation of the board clerk. "We're looking for adoption or guardianship records from last year," Sean explained. "Specifically, a girl about 5 named Alina." The clerk typed on a computer for several minutes, then shook his head. "No formal adoption under that name." "What about school records?" Richard suggested. "New enrollments over the past year." More typing. "We have 3 Alinas in local schools," the clerk said. Alina Jenkins, age 8, Alina Petrova, age 12, and Alina Matthews, age 5, enrolled at Riverview Elementary about 10 months ago. Richard and Sean exchanged looks. "Can we see Alina Matthews's record?" Sean asked. The clerk hesitated, but another discreet bill ended his reluctance. Minutes later, they had copies of the school enrollment forms in hand. Richard studied the paperwork with trembling hands. A small photo was stapled to the top corner. A little girl with light brown hair and green eyes, her face serious for the official photo, but unmistakably Alina. His Alina. "It's her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sean, it's her." The details on the form were a mix of truth and lies. Name, Alina Matthews. Date of birth, correct. Parents' names, James and Elizabeth Matthews. Address 247 Cedar Lane, Riverview. Documents are forged, Sean noted, pointing to subtle inconsistencies in stamps and signatures. But well done, enough to pass a basic check. Richard could barely hear him. He couldn't tear his eyes from Alina's photo. A year older than when he'd last seen her, more serious, her eyes a bit less bright, but alive. His daughter was alive. "Let's go," he said, his voice suddenly firm, determined. "We have an address." Cedar Lane was in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Well-kept houses with spacious yards, bikes in the driveways, swings in trees. A perfectly ordinary place to raise a family. The perfect place to hide a kidnapped child. Sean parked 2 houses down from 247, a light blue 2-story house with a white fence and a tidy garden. Utterly normal, utterly unsuspecting. "What do we do now?" Richard asked, eyes fixed on the house where his daughter might be. "We watch first," Sean replied. "Confirm she's there. Then we plan." Richard nodded, although every part of him screamed to run to that door and demand his daughter back. But he knew Sean was right. They had to be cautious, for Alina's safety. "She's there," he said, more to himself than to Sean. "I can feel it." So close. After a year of nightmares and despair, after almost losing hope, he was just a few yards away from his daughter. "I'll bring you home, Alina," he promised in silence. "I'm here now." Richard slept barely a wink that night. He and Sean stayed at a small hotel downtown, only minutes from Cedar Lane. After hours of surveillance, they had seen a man and a woman, probably in their 40s, come and go, but no sign of Alina. Which wasn't surprising. It was late, likely past bedtime for a 6-year-old. The early morning hours crawled by as Richard lay staring at the motel ceiling, his heart beating an uneven rhythm. More than once, he picked up his phone to call Mrs. Cooper to check on the triplets, but each time he saw the time and put it down again. Finally, as the first rays of daylight crept through the thin curtains, he got up to face the day that could change his life forever. "Let's go over the plan again," Sean said over breakfast at a nearby diner. "We watch the house in the morning. If we confirm Alina's there, we contact the local police." Richard shook his head, stirring his untouched coffee. "We've discussed this. If the police get involved, it becomes complicated. Investigations, child protective services, court hearings that could drag on for months." "That's the proper procedure, Richard," Sean insisted. "Legally." "Legally, I'm her father," Richard interjected. "I have her original birth certificate, photos, medical records. They have forged paperwork. I'm not here to regain custody. Sean, I'm here to take my daughter home." Sean studied his friend's tense face for a long moment. What if they resist? Then we call the police, Richard conceded. But first, I want to talk to them, person to person, father to father. The detective still looked unconvinced but nodded. All right, let's do it. And they arrived at Cedar Lane shortly after 8 in the morning. The neighborhood was waking up. A man fetched the newspaper from his driveway. A woman walked a golden retriever. Children waited for a school bus on the corner with brightly colored backpacks slung over their shoulders. Richard felt a lump in his chest at the thought of Alina living this normal routine, going to school each morning, coming home each afternoon, while he spent his days plagued by uncertainty. They parked across the street, a few houses away from 247. The blue house was quiet, a silver minivan in the driveway suggesting someone was home. And now? Sean asked. Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the side yard, where a slight movement had caught his attention. A screen door opened and closed, and then, like an apparition, out stepped a small girl. Light brown hair in a loose braid, a pale blue dress over leggings, white sneakers with little stars on the sides. She carried a book and seemed to be looking for a spot to sit. Alina, Richard whispered, all the air leaving his lungs. It was her, a year older, a bit taller, but unmistakably his daughter. Richard opened the car door before he realized what he was doing. "Richard, wait," Sean started, but he was already out, crossing the street in what felt like slow motion. His heart thundered as he reached the white picket fence that bordered the yard. Alina had settled under a large maple tree, leaning against the trunk, the book open in her lap. She hadn't seen him yet. Richard stopped at the edge of the yard, unable to take another step. What would he say? How would he explain his presence? What if she screamed? What if she was afraid of him? What if she didn't recognize him? But then, as though sensing his presence, Alina lifted her gaze from the book. For a moment, she looked at him blankly, as if seeing a stranger. Richard felt his heart sink. Then something changed in her face. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly. The book slipped from her lap as she stood slowly, as if in a trance. Richard couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The world around them vanished. The distant traffic, the birds in the trees, the sounds of the morning in a quiet neighborhood. Everything compressed into this moment, this connection that a year of separation had not broken. Alina took a hesitant step toward him, then another. Her lips formed a silent word. "Daddy?" And then she was running, crossing the lawn with the speed only a child can manage. Richard dropped to his knees as she reached him, opening his arms just in time to catch her in an embrace that felt like the end of a nightmare and the start of a dream. Alina flung her arms around his neck with surprising strength, her small body trembling with emotions too big to hold. "You found me," she whispered against his neck, her voice exactly as he remembered, only slightly more mature. "You found me." Richard couldn't answer. Tears he'd held back for so long now flowed freely as he held his daughter, his Alina, alive, real, back in his arms. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, feeling her warmth, confirming with each passing second that this was not another one of the painful reunion dreams that had tormented him for months. He didn't know how long they remained like that. Seconds, minutes, or hours. Time had lost its meaning. He only returned to reality when he heard a startled voice coming from the direction of the house. "Alina? Alina? Who is that man? Get away from him!" Richard looked up to see a woman in her 40s racing across the lawn toward them, her face twisted with fear and alarm. He stood, keeping Alina close at his side, an arm protectively around her small shoulders. "My name is Richard Cole," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "I'm Alina's father." The woman stopped abruptly, her face paling. She looked at Alina, who now clung to Richard's waist, her face pressed against him, refusing to let go. That's not possible," she stammered. We adopted her, legally." "No, ma'am, you didn't," Richard replied, keeping his tone firm but not hostile. "My daughter was abducted a year ago. The adoption paperwork you have is falsified." The woman staggered slightly, one hand flying to her mouth. At that moment, Sean approached, standing beside Richard. "I suggest we continue this conversation inside," he said in a professional tone. unless you'd prefer to discuss it out here in front of the neighbors." The woman, Elizabeth Matthews, presumably, looked around, spotting a neighbor watering plants and watching curiously. She gave a stiff nod and headed back toward the house. "James," she called as soon as they entered. "James!" A man quickly appeared in the living room, still in a bathrobe, hair damp from a recent shower. His confused gaze moved from his wife to the strangers, then to Alina, who was still clinging to Richard as though he might vanish if she let go. "What's happening?" he asked, voice tense. "He says he's Alina's father," Elizabeth replied, her words trembling. "He says she was abducted." The man's face went white. "It's true," Richard said, pulling out his wallet with one hand while keeping the other on Alina's shoulder. "I have documents, photos, everything you need to confirm." Over the next 20 minutes, seated in the neat Matthews living room, Richard showed the proof he carried: Alina's original birth certificate, pictures from infancy until the day she disappeared, newspaper clippings about the kidnapping, even an old health insurance card with her name. Alina never let go of him. Sitting by his side on the couch, she kept one hand wrapped around his, as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear again. Occasionally, she looked at his face, as though she too needed to confirm he was real. James Matthews put his head in his hands as the reality sank in. "Oh my God," he murmured. "Oh my God, we didn't know." "I swear we didn't know." "How did she end up with you?" Sean asked, his tone gentler now, the accusatory edge replaced by something close to pity. Elizabeth exchanged a quick look with her husband before answering. "We tried to adopt for years," she began, "through official channels, but there was so much red tape, so many rejections. Our age, our income, there was always some issue. Then a friend of a friend mentioned a couple who helped connect children with loving homes, without all the bureaucracy." "It sounded perfect," James continued. "They showed us photos of several kids, said these were special cases, orphans, children abandoned, complicated situations where the birth parents had relinquished rights, but the system hadn't processed it yet." "And Alina?" Richard pressed. "They said she was the daughter of a single mother who had passed away," Elizabeth explained, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "That the father was never in her life and had signed over custody. They showed us documents. They looked legitimate." "How much did you pay?" Sean asked. 50,000, James admitted quietly, "for processing fees and legal costs." Richard felt a wave of nausea but pushed it down. This was not the time for anger or judgment. Alina was what mattered. She listened quietly, unusually so for a 6-year-old, but it was clear she was absorbing every word. "I always knew you'd come," she suddenly said, surprising all the adults in the room. "I dreamed about you. Every night." The simplicity of her statement hit Richard like a physical blow. He squeezed her tiny hand. "I missed you so much, sweetheart," he replied, his voice trembling. "I looked for you every single day." Alina nodded, as though this was exactly what she had expected to hear. "I tried to be good," she went on, glancing at the Matthews. "They were nice to me, but they weren't me," Richard finished gently. Alina nodded again, resting her head on his arm. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, sobbing silently. James looked stunned, defeated. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Do we go to jail?" Sean stepped in. "Technically, you're in possession of a kidnapped child with forged documents. Those are serious crimes." The Matthews seemed to shrink further. Richard noted the obvious care with which they kept their home, the children's books on the shelves. Photos of Alina smiling in frames around the room. They might have been deceived, but they had loved his daughter. They'd cared for her when he couldn't. "I don't want the police involved," he finally said, "as long as you cooperate." Hope flickered on the Matthews' faces. "We'll do anything," Elizabeth said quickly. Richard took a deep breath. "I need to take Alina home today, right now, with no complications or delays." "Of course," James agreed, though the pain in his voice was evident. "And I need you to tell me everything you know about the couple who brought Alina to you. Names, contacts, how you found them, everything. They need to be stopped before they do this to more families, more children." The couple nodded in unison. "We'll tell you everything," James promised. Sean looked surprised at Richard's conciliatory approach, but did not interfere. Richard felt Alina grip his hand, and he knew he was making the right choice. More trauma, more conflict, wouldn't help anyone, especially his daughter. "Alina, sweetie," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking, "you need to go with your father now. He missed you so much." Alina turned to the woman who had been her stand-in mother for the past year. "Can I get my things?" she asked, the first sign that she might miss something about this temporary home. "Of course, dear," Elizabeth replied. "I'll help you pack." An hour later, with the Matthews minivan loaded with boxes containing Alina's belongings, clothes, books, toys, even a small fish tank with a goldfish, they were ready to depart. Sean would drive the rental car back, while Richard would take Alina in the minivan, which James insisted they keep. "It's the least we can do," he had said. The goodbye was quiet and charged with contradictory emotions. The Matthews clearly struggled against the urge to hug Alina one last time, while the girl stayed close to Richard, still fearing he might vanish. "Will you be okay?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the question. Elizabeth offered a trembling smile. Eventually, knowing she's where she belongs helps. Phone numbers were exchanged for any further information on the kidnappers and, perhaps one day, to let the Matthews know how Alina was doing, though no formal promises were made. As Richard helped Alina settle in the front passenger seat, adjusting her seatbelt, a sudden thought struck him. "Do you still have the necklace?" he asked. "The star necklace." Alina shook her head. "They took it off me. They said it could identify me." Richard nodded, mentally noting to tell her about Hazel and the necklace later. There was so much to explain, so many small miracles to share. The drive home felt surreal. Richard alternated between watching the road and glancing at the passenger seat, still unable to fully believe his daughter was actually there. Alina fell asleep after the first hour, exhaustion from the emotional turmoil finally catching up with her. He used that time to call Mrs. Cooper, letting her know he'd be home that evening with a special surprise for the girls. Then, with Alina still peacefully sleeping, he allowed himself to finally absorb the magnitude of what had happened. His daughter was coming home. The nightmare was over. It was nearly dusk when they arrived. The house was lit, and Richard could see movement through the windows, likely the triplets helping Mrs. Cooper with dinner. He parked the minivan in the driveway and turned off the engine. "We're here, sweetheart," he said softly, touching Alina's shoulder. She stirred, blinking at the familiar sight of the house. "Our house," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes," Richard agreed. "But I have a surprise for you." Alina looked at him, curious. "Remember how I told you about the 3 girls who helped me find you? One of them found your star necklace." She nodded, her tiredness fading in the excitement of something new. "They're staying with us now. They're triplets, 3 sisters who were born together, Hazel, Mila, and Lena. They had no one to take care of them, so you're going to be their dad too?" Alina asked, surprising him with her insight. "I think so," he answered honestly, "if that's okay with you." Alina considered it for a moment, then smiled. A full, genuine smile that Richard hadn't seen since finding her. "I always wanted sisters," she said simply. The front door opened, and Mrs. Cooper appeared, probably alerted by the sound of the car. Richard motioned for her to wait and turned to Alina. "Ready to meet them?" Alina nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt with determination. In the living room, the triplets stood in a row like little soldiers, clearly instructed by Mrs. Cooper to be on their best behavior. Their eyes widened at the sight of Richard walking in hand with an unfamiliar girl. Richard knelt, so he was at the height of the 4 children who now meant the world to him. "Hazel, Mila, Lena," he said gently. "This is Alina, my daughter. We found her." The triplets looked at Alina with a mix of curiosity and awe. Hazel, especially, seemed fascinated. "Alina," Richard continued, "these are the girls who helped me find you, especially Hazel, who found your star necklace." Alina stepped forward, suddenly shy but determined. "Hi," she said, offering a small smile. "Do you want to play with me?" Mila surprised him by responding first, stepping forward and extending her hand with an almost adult-like gesture. "We have a new board game," she said. "Mrs. Cooper gave it to us. It's for 4 players." Alina took her offered hand, and then, as if an invisible barrier broke, Lena and Hazel also moved closer. In seconds, all 4 girls were on the floor. Alina opening the box while the triplets crowded around, everyone talking at once. Richard watched them, a sense of completeness spreading through his chest that he never thought he'd feel again. Mrs. Cooper sniffled discreetly by his side. "It's her, isn't it? The little one who was missing," she whispered. Richard nodded, unable to take his eyes off the 4 children, now laughing as they set colorful pieces on the board. "A miracle, Mrs. Cooper murmured. "A true miracle." 4 miracles, Richard corrected softly, observing how Alina, with the ease of childhood, already assumed the role of big sister, showing Hazel where to place her piece, helping Lena understand the rules. The house, silent for so long after Alina's disappearance, now overflowed with life, childish voices, and possibilities. There was still much to sort out: legal processes to formalize custody of the triplets, therapy for Alina to process the trauma of her abduction, and the ongoing investigation into the couple who had taken her. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, for this moment, there was only this: 4 girls playing in a brightly lit living room, safe, together. And Richard watching them, finally at peace. The puzzle of his family, once incomplete and painful, was now complete in a way he could never have imagined. Different from the original plan, certainly. More complicated, fuller, infinitely richer, perfect in its imperfection. The months following Alina's return were filled with adjustment and healing. At night, Richard often woke to the sound of crying. Sometimes Alina, haunted by nightmares. Sometimes the triplets, still unsure that this new life wouldn't vanish by morning. Each time, he rose without hesitation, offering comfort with a naturalness that had become part of him. The girls quickly developed a bond that even surprised Richard. Alina, despite being only slightly older, took on the role of big sister with impressive grace. She taught the triplets new games, shared her favorite books, and included all 3 in every activity. The triplets, in turn, adored their new sister and quickly found their individual places within the family. Mila remained the protector, always watchful. Lena revealed a talent for music and a contagious laugh that lit up the house. Hazel Cassie, the quietest, amazed everyone with her prodigious memory and eye for tiny details, traits that made Richard smile, recalling how she had noticed and kept the necklace that would change all their destinies. The house was rearranged for the expanded family. The old guest room officially became the triplets' bedroom, with 3 beds positioned so they could talk before sleep. Alina's room was also redone, with colors and accents she picked herself, a reclamation of the space that had been empty for so long. Behind the scenes, Richard worked with Sean and the authorities to ensure that the couple responsible for Alina's kidnapping faced justice. The investigation exposed a complex network of illegal adoptions, and multiple families were affected. Richard felt bittersweet satisfaction, knowing more children might be found because of what they had uncovered. At the same time, the formal adoption process for the triplets moved forward. Social workers visited regularly, assessing the household and observing the family's interactions. Their reports were always positive. The girls were thriving, the home was safe and welcoming, and Richard demonstrated all the qualities of a devoted father. And then, at last, the day of the adoption hearing arrived. The courthouse was nearly empty that Thursday morning. Only a few staff members, the assigned social worker, and Sean, now a close friend of the family, occupied the polished benches. Richard straightened his tie anxiously, more nervous than he'd ever been in any business meeting. Next to him, the 4 girls sat in a row, each wearing a dress in a different shade of blue, a choice they had insisted on for the special occasion. "It's okay, Daddy," Alina whispered, squeezing his hand. "It'll all be fine." The word Daddy still sent a wave of emotion through Richard. It was a title he had almost lost forever with Alina, and which would soon officially be extended to 3 more small hearts. "Adoption case number 47329, announced the clerk. "Cole and dependents." Judge Robinson, A middle-aged woman with keen eyes behind thin-framed glasses offered a brief smile to the girls before assuming a more formal expression. "Mr. Cole, you're here today to finalize the adoption of Hazel, Mila, and Lena Martinez, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Richard replied. The judge looked over the documents in front of her. "The social worker's reports are extremely positive. The home is suitable. The children are well-adjusted and attending school regularly." She looked at the triplets. "Girls, are you happy living with Mr. Cole and Alina?" All three nodded vigorously, but it was Mila who spoke up. "Very happy, Your Honor. And do you understand what adoption means? That Mr. Cole will legally become your father." "It means we'll always stay together," Mila answered. "All four of us. And that he'll really be our dad, not just for now," Lena added. Hazel only nodded, her eyes shining with a quiet certainty. "Mr. Cole," the judge continued, "would you like to say anything before I render my decision?" Richard hadn't prepared a formal speech. He thought of the practiced words he could say about responsibility, commitment, about the future he planned for the girls. But looking at the four faces turned toward him, full of trust and hope, the words that emerged were wholly different. "Your Honor," he began softly but clearly, "a year ago, I lost my daughter. My world fell apart. I searched for her in every corner, every shadow. Then, when I was close to losing hope, I found 3 little girls crying in a grocery store." He paused, emotion tightening his throat. "I went out looking for one daughter. I found 4. And now I can't imagine my life without any of them." The room fell silent for a moment. Judge Robinson discreetly adjusted her glasses, wiping the corner of her eye. "Well," she finally said, "based on the reports and what I've seen here today, I have no doubt about my ruling." She picked up her gavel and looked straight at the girls. "Hazel, Mila, and Lena, from this moment on, you are officially the daughters of Richard Cole, with all the rights and privileges that implies. You are now legally sisters to Alina and part of this family. Congratulations to all of you." The gavel strike echoed in the courtroom, but for Richard it felt like the whole world resonated with that single sound of finality and promise. Before he could stand, 4 small bodies collided with him in a group hug, Alina jumping out of her seat to join the triplets. Richard knelt, hugging all 4 at once, feeling their tiny arms around his neck, hearing laughter, sighs, and even a few joyful sobs. A family was officially born in that moment, not united by blood, but by something just as powerful, by choice, by love, by truth. Sasta Segaskidi a few weeks later, Richard arrived home carrying a carefully wrapped package. The girls, just back from school, found him in the living room. "What's that, Dad?" Alina asked, always quick to notice anything new. "A surprise," he said. "Call your sisters." When all 4 had gathered, Richard removed the wrapping paper, revealing a dark wooden frame with tiny star details along the edges. Behind the glass was the silver star necklace, the same one Hazel had found, the same one that had connected their destinies in unforeseen ways. Below the necklace, engraved on a polished metal plate, were 4 names: Alina. "Hazel, Mila, Lena." "That's my necklace," Alina exclaimed, touching the glass reverently. "The necklace I found," Hazel murmured, eyes wide. "It's the necklace that brought us together," Richard explained. "That helped us find each other. I thought it deserved a special place in our home." With the girls' help, he hung the frame on the main wall of the living room, where it would be the first thing any visitor would see, a symbol of the extraordinary journey they had taken. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Richard stood in the living room looking up at the framed necklace. He remembered the agony of losing Alina, the emptiness that consumed his life. He remembered the moment he saw the necklace on Hazel's neck, the spark of hope igniting in his chest. He remembered finding Alina in that yard, the recognition in her eyes, the simple words that changed everything. "You found me." The house, once a mausoleum of silence and loss, now pulsed with life. There were drawings on the fridge, small shoes by the door, laughter echoing through the halls. Days now had purpose, getting the girls to school, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories. Nights had peace, 4 gentle breaths, 4 safe hearts under one roof. Richard gently touched the frame, feeling the outline of the star that had changed his life. The necklace hadn't given him answers to the tortured questions he'd asked during Alina's absence. Instead, it had brought something far more valuable. It brought new beginnings for all of them. A new start, shaped by love, unity, and the promise that none of them would ever face the world alone again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.